The Lost Tribes from Outer Space by Mark Dem. Part 3. At noon, sun time, the rain that had been falling stopped abruptly. The clouds disappeared, or seemed to disappear. The sun, which had been invisible for 2 days, came out. It had an extraordinary appearance. It was a disk resembling a pale silver plaque with a pearly luster, surrounded by a halo. The people who saw it could look directly at it without being dazzled. This sun was not motionless. It revolved for a time without changing its position, then it dipped downward and returned to its original place, following a path that formed a perfect ellipse. In the course of this movement, it continued revolving and described little loops. When the demonstration was over, the sun resumed the brilliance that is normal for it at noon on an October day in the northern hemisphere. Since no one thought to look at his watch, the exact duration of the phenomenon is not known, but it must not have been more than a quarter of an hour. Authors who have gathered testimony and collected press clippings from the time found no notable variations. There were 6 Fatima apparitions in all. Several phenomena besides the solar marvel were observed. In the 5th apparition, there was a luminous globe that seemed to bring from the sky, then take back into it, the invisible personage who spoke with the shepherds. The Fatima marvel is unusual in that it has not been purely and simply denied by scientists. That is precluded by the number of witnesses and the quality of some of them. Scientists have taken the occurrence seriously enough to offer an explanation. It was a collective hallucination. It is interesting to note the relation between the terms collective hallucination and mutation. They are brought out whenever an unknown phenomenon must be explained. Then they are put back in the dictionary with definitions distinguished by containing no examples. Since the idea of a collective hallucination cannot be applied to the Fatima marvel any better than to Victor Hugo's funeral or the conquest of England by the Normans, we are entitled to look for a more solid hypothesis. Does it not seem to have been found when we recall Joshua's battle in Gibeon? In both cases, the sun took liberties with celestial mechanics. In both cases, we are led to wonder if there was a confusion between 2 bodies of the same apparent size. The explanation may lie in a screen of clouds that was thought to have been dispersed, but actually remained, made invisible by a new source of light. Canon Barthus, who says he is writing at the request of church authorities and would certainly not share my viewpoint, uses these revealing words: the sun, or the miraculous image that took its place. So the idea of a substitution is plausible to a specialist who spent 30 years studying the Fatima marvel. How did the marvel end? When the sun returned to the zenith, writes Barthus, it resumed its natural brilliance and could no longer be looked at directly. From that point on, we are dealing with the actual sun, and there is no longer any problem. But in order for the crowd to have seen the event in that way, the interposed object had to disappear at the exact position occupied by the sun. It could have done so, for example, by rapidly moving away along the line of sight between the crowd and the sun, a maneuver that is perfectly conceivable. Being much closer to the Earth and capable of moving at great speed, the spacecraft could have vanished into the sunlight in a fraction of a second. An article published 2 days afterward in a Portuguese newspaper, O Século, contains this surprising remark. It looked like an eclipse. At first, it is hard to see what could have suggested that comparison to the reporter, but reflection shows that it is strikingly significant. There is said to be an eclipse when, from the viewpoint of an earthly observer, one heavenly body passes in front of another, wholly or partially hiding it, and therefore reducing the intensity of the light coming from it. When the reporter had the impression of an eclipse, he was seeing the silvery disk of the miraculous object that appeared to be blotting out the real sun. From where did Yahawah's spacecraft draw its luminosity? In Gibeon, it might have been from the sun, which had already set, but was still able to illuminate an object high enough in the sky to receive its rays, as it does with the moon. In Fatima, this is ruled out because the spacecraft passed in front of the sun, unless we assume that light was somehow dispersed in such a way as to illuminate the side away from the sun. I believe it is more reasonable to assume that the spacecraft produced its own light. Another of its properties is shown in a secondary effect. When the apparition was over, the witnesses were amazed to find that their clothes, which had been soaking wet from the steady rain, were perfectly dry, and the puddles on the ground had disappeared. What temperature would have to be diffused in order to evaporate in less than 15 minutes the amount of water accumulated from a heavy rain that had been falling since early morning? The roads and paths had been transformed into mires in which people floundered and vehicles bogged down. Yet no one complained of being hot, and no wind was blowing. I will not try to explain how it happened. I will merely point out that acting on water is a specialty of Yahawah. It was easier for him to dry the site of Fatima than to open the Red Sea before the Hebrews, and his mastery of pneumatic technology enabled him to sweep away the clouds when he no longer needed them. Such is the way in which the celestial partner of the Israelites, and consequently of all mankind, has presented himself in our time as well as in antiquity. It gives new meaning to the question, do you believe in God? A God who, as we will see, is not without disquieting aspects. Chapter 7. Interlude. The curious episode of the struggle with the angel. There is something incongruous, even monstrous, about the struggle with the angel that took place the night before the confrontation between Jacob and his brother Esau. It appears to be a fragment of an epic that goes far beyond the framework of a family quarrel, since the story would be perfectly coherent without the intrusion of that strange scene. It is easy to think of it as coming from a much older tradition that had been lost except for a fragment that the Elohistic author used in relation to Jacob. Having a shaky claim to the birthright he had acquired from Esau, Jacob needed a new legitimation, and what he demanded of his mysterious adversary was a blessing. He had shown a liking for blessings earlier. It was in order to receive his father's that he had disguised himself as Esau. The idea of an inserted passage takes nothing away from Jacob, but it makes us give closer attention to the 9 verses in question. Genesis 32, 24 through 32. It seems to me that they evoke the relationship between Yahawah and his creature in a much earlier era, and that, unknown even to the narrator, they were meant to convey an essential truth to us. First, let us recall the details of the combat, recounted in a style in which I believe a certain archaic quality is discernible. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him there till daybreak. The struggle went on in silence. Only the essential points of it are described. The man injured Jacob, but could not defeat him. At dawn, he offered to stop fighting, but Jacob would not let him go until he paid for his freedom by blessing him. The man then revealed his identity by saying, "You strove with God and with men and prevailed." The light of the rising sun enabled Jacob to confirm this. I have seen God face to face, and my life is spared, so there is no ambiguity. It was with Yahawah that Jacob had fought, and Yahawah had not won. That is the striking part of the episode, and it has always shocked readers of the Bible, unless they have one of those soothing translations that deftly juggle away the harshest truths. What conclusion are we to draw from this surviving fragment of a lost whole? Let us consider it knowingly. That is, bearing in mind the rules of oral tradition. In oral tradition, it is the basic idea that must be passed along, not any particular form. An adequate form is one that will keep the idea afloat and bring it to port despite the hazards of transmission by word of mouth. Let us assume that we have identified the message to be passed on as the following. Yahawah has the appearance of a man, even though he has technical knowledge far superior to ours and is recognized as belonging to another species as soon as he is seen. In this abstract form, the message would obviously have no chance of going any farther than the first hearer, even assuming that he understood it. Let us therefore proceed in a different way by choosing a real or imaginary event in which the message is contained by implication. Let us arrange it into a kind of parable, easy to relate, whose components are closely linked to each other. Let us load it like a grenade, putting into it an element that will cause surprise, a surprise bordering on incredulity. What do we obtain? A story like the one told in the Bible, for example, Jacob's struggle with the angel. We can separate the message into three parts. 1. Yahawah has the appearance of a man. He wrestles with Jacob as any man would do. He strikes him in the hollow of the thigh and dislocates his hip. 2. Even though he has technical knowledge far superior to ours, Yahawah is defeated in the struggle. He must therefore be superior to Jacob and human beings in general on another level, because otherwise no one would bother to preserve the story of the fight. It would be an insignificant, commonplace incident. There is nothing extraordinary about the idea that Jacob fought and defeated someone he met on the road. The encounter becomes significant only if that someone is Yahawah. In hand-to-hand combat, when he does not make use of his singular powers, Yahawah can be beaten by an ordinary man like Jacob, who not long before had stayed home and made lentil soup instead of distinguishing himself as a hunter like his brother Esau. 3. But as soon as you see him, you know he belongs to another species, that he is a visitor from space. Having overcome his adversary, Jacob is entitled to despise him, to see him only as a man he has surpassed in physical strength. In the first light of day, however, he recognizes him as a superior being and immediately believes what he is told by him. You strove with God and with men. Because of its incongruity, the story is well calculated to stick in the memory of anyone who hears it. When he has assimilated the message it contains to the question, who is Yahawah? He will give an answer along these lines. Yahawah outwardly resembles a man, and his physical strength is no greater than ours, but he has vastly greater knowledge and power, and that is why we sing his praises. Did the struggle really take place? True stories have a special vitality that distinguishes them from imaginary ones. If the struggle goes back to a very old tradition, there is a strong likelihood that it actually occurred. The name of the man was one of the men formed from the dust of the ground, one of the Jews whose lineage began with Adam. What was Yahweh's purpose in that nocturnal fight? Perhaps he wanted to evaluate his creature's physical strength, or increase his confidence, or make him earn the blessing he intended to give him. Rabbis have not adopted any of these interpretations. They have tamed the troublesome episode by reducing its significance to the establishment of a dietary rule. This is why the Israelites to this day do not eat the sinew of the nerve that runs in the hollow of the thigh, for the man had struck Jacob on that nerve in the hollow of the thigh. Genesis 32:32. Chapter 8. Everyday life in the time when Yahawah frequented the earth. Yahawah's actual presence became less and less necessary as the Jewish people became more distinct, developed their internal cohesion, and marked off their distances from the other inhabitants of the planet. At first, it was different. The celestial visitor had to show himself and display his power. For a number of millennia that is hard to evaluate, what was later to be regarded as a series of astounding miracles was part of the everyday life of the Israelites and their near neighbors. Yahawah did not come out of the spacecraft alone. He was accompanied by angels. The first mention of them occurs in the 16th chapter of Genesis, where the angel of the Lord tells the slave girl Hagar to return to her mistress. There is an ambiguity, however, because at one point in the scene, it is apparently Yahawah himself who is speaking to her, and she calls him El Roy, God of vision. This confusion appears in many other places and shows that Earthlings did not make a sharp distinction between the captain of the spacecraft and his subordinates. Furthermore, if the spacecraft was also called Yahawah, an angel of Yahawah may have been anyone who came from it. In any case, there were undoubtedly several visitors, since they sometimes came in a group. Shortly before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, three men, one of whom was Yahawah, conversed with Abraham and ate the meal he offered them. When the Hebrews were about to cross the Red Sea, the angel of God directed the movement of the pillar of cloud so that it hid them from the pursuing Egyptians. The guiding angel sent on this occasion probably belonged to the military personnel of the spacecraft, like the technical advisor sent to Joshua before the taking of Jericho. When Joshua came near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and said, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" And the man said to him, "I am here as captain of the army of the Lord." Joshua 5:13 and 14. Like their leader, the angels had the outer appearance of earthly men. This is obvious from what happened to two of them at Lot's house in Sodom, as related in the 19th chapter of Genesis. Having taken shelter for the night with the only righteous man in the city, the two angels caused a great stir among the male population. Before they lay down to sleep, the men of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house, everyone without exception. They called to Lot and asked him where the men were who had entered his house that night. "Bring them out," they shouted, "so that we may have intercourse with them." In an effort to defend his guests, Lot offered the assailants his daughters. "I have two daughters, both virgins. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do what you like with them." But they threatened to break open the door to seize the two space travelers. As we have seen, the occupants of the satellite could make it hover above a place that interested them. How did they go from it to the ground? It seems that in most cases, they used no special equipment. They simply appeared near the person they wanted to meet. It was like a transmission of matter in which the physical body was disintegrated at its point of departure, then reconstituted at its destination. I am not saying that Yahawah's trips from the satellite to the ground were made in this way. I am only saying that they suggest it more strongly than anything else. Sometimes it was different. The visitors were seen in the air while they were coming down. David looked up and saw the angel of the Lord standing between earth and heaven. 1 Chronicles 21:16. Use of a physical device is sometimes mentioned, as in the meeting between Yahawah and the elders of Israel in Exodus 24:9-10. And they saw the God of Israel. Under his feet there was, as it were, a pavement of sapphire, clear blue as the very heavens. This is even clearer in 2 Samuel 22:8-11. The earth heaved and quaked, heaven's foundations shook. They heaved because he was angry. Smoke rose from his nostrils, devouring fire came from his mouth, glowing coals and searing heat. He swept the skies aside as he descended. Thick darkness lay under his feet. He rode like a cherub. He flew through the air. He swooped on the wings of the wind. When Yahawah presented himself to Moses for the first time, it was in the middle of a bush that seemed to be burning but was not consumed. Although the narrator uses the word name for lack of any other, it was actually a very bright light that came either from the visitor himself, principle of transfiguration, or from the device he had used for descending from his spaceship. Moses was told to take off his sandals, which suggests that he needed to be grounded by removing their insulating soles from under his feet. We do not know what kind of current the visitors used for this type of individual landing. Following the principle of not closing the door to research by suggesting an explanation that might have a scientific appearance but would actually be only a guess. I will limit myself to merely noting the phenomenon. We must bear in mind that the Bible is an aggregation of traditions in which truth is fragmented and scattered. We must be willing to investigate every possible path to it without expecting to uncover it all at once. There are many mentions of a divine chariot that may have been another means of transportation used by the strange astronaut. Nowhere does it appear more clearly than in the story of how Elijah was taken up to heaven in 2 Kings 2:11. They, Elijah and Elisha, went on, talking as they went, and suddenly there appeared chariots of fire and horses of fire, which separated them one from the other, and Elijah was carried up in the whirlwind to heaven. Yahawah had established bases on earth. The Bible mentions them without comment, which shows that they were part of everyday reality. They do not seem to have had any special equipment. Nothing is said about installations that might have suggested a military camp or a center for the arrival and departure of spacecraft. They were places where the visitors came down before going off to regions where they had things to do. A significant detail: the word house is used again to designate one of these places. Jacob called the place where God had spoken with him Bethel, Genesis 35:15. Bethel means house of God. Yahawah himself had indicated the place to Jacob, Luz, in Canaan. It was given its new name to remind future generations of the conversation between their forefather and the visitor from space. When Yahawah had left, Jacob erected a sacred pillar there. It is interesting to note that this was the region where Yahawah had appeared to Abraham, Genesis 12:7. The terms employed and the way things happen suggest the idea of mysterious corridors, along which the visitors could come and go discreetly, without using noisy equipment and disturbing the natural environment they wanted to change as little as possible. But on the day when Jacob left to consecrate the base at Bethel, there was an event that affected a large area. Then they set out, and the cities round about were panic-stricken, and the inhabitants dared not pursue the sons of Jacob. Genesis 35:5. Was the panic created by means of a visible phenomenon? The Bible does not say, and precisely because it does not, it could easily have described the appearance of a cloud or a ball of fire, the usual manifestations of the spacecraft's approach. It is plausible to think of some sort of psychological action, a panic created in the minds of the surrounding people to protect Jacob and his household from their hostility. Those people had good reason to be hostile. Shechem, son of Hamor, the local prince, had wanted to marry Jacob's daughter Dinah. Jacob's sons, opposed to the marriage, had used a ruse. They told Shechem and Hamor that if they and all their men would be circumcised, they would give their sister Dinah to Shechem. While the men were still in great pain from the operation, two of Jacob's sons went into the city and killed them all. Then his other sons came in, plundered the city, and carried off all the women and livestock. But because of the panic created by Yahawah, Jacob and his sons were able to leave the region without being attacked. To appeal for protection from celestial powers who, as we have seen, were not the same as the God who knows and sees everything, a means of communication was needed. Yahawah took the initiative in having it built. He gave Moses remarkably precise instructions. Make an ark, a chest of acacia wood, 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, and 1.5 cubits high. Overlay it with pure gold both inside and out, and put a band of gold all round it. Cast 4 gold rings for it, and fasten them to its 4 feet, 2 rings on each side. Make poles of acacia wood, and plate them with gold, and insert the poles in the rings at the side of the ark to lift it. The poles shall remain in the rings of the ark, and never be removed. Put into the ark the tokens of the covenant, which I shall give you. Make a cover of pure gold, 2.5 cubits long and 1.5 cubits wide. Make 2 gold cherubim of beaten work at the ends of the cover, one at each end. Make each cherub of one piece with the cover. They shall be made with wings outspread and pointing upwards, and shall screen the cover with their wings. They shall be face to face, looking inwards over the cover. Put the cover above the ark, and put into the ark the tokens that I shall give you. It is there that I shall meet you, and from above the cover, between the 2 cherubim over the ark of the tokens, I shall deliver to you all my commands for the Israelites. Exodus 25:10-22. Could the function of the Ark of the Covenant have been stated more clearly? It was not a ritual object of the kind found in all religions, including Judaism. It was a device enabling Yahawah to communicate with the leader of his people, to give him orders and hear his calls for help. It was portable. It had 4 rings for the poles by which the Levites were to carry it. It was later to be placed by Solomon in the Holy of Holies of the temple he built in Jerusalem. Until then, it accompanied the Jews in their wanderings, like a piece of equipment always ready for use. It was sheltered by a tent, or tabernaculum in Latin, which is the origin of the name of the tabernacle in Catholic liturgy. The spiritual reality represented by the ark was transposed into the spiritual domain, but originally, during the classic period of Jewish history, it was a utilitarian piece of equipment. The tabernacle that enclosed it was called the Tent of the Presence, and it is expressly stated that Yahawah met Moses in it and spoke with him as one man speaks to another. Its function is described several times. Moses used to take a tent and pitch it at a distance outside the camp. He called it the Tent of the Presence, and everyone who sought the Lord would go out to the Tent of the Presence outside the camp. Whenever Moses went out to the tent, all the people would rise and stand, each at the entrance to his tent, and follow Moses with their eyes until he entered the tent. When Moses entered it, the pillar of cloud came down and stayed at the entrance to the tent while the Lord spoke with Moses. Exodus 33:7-9. Let us go forward through the centuries. How did communication take place shortly before the monarchy, in the time of Samuel? In exactly the same way. The 3rd chapter of 1 Samuel describes reception of a message from the satellite or another planet. The young Samuel was sleeping in the temple of Yahawah at Shiloh, in the Holy of Holies where the ark was kept. No doubt because of his status as a novice, he was on duty there while Eli, the priest, slept comfortably in his bedroom. In the middle of the night, Samuel heard someone call him. He got up and went to Eli, who said to him, "No, I did not call you. Lie down again." The same thing happened again, then a 3rd time. It did not occur to Samuel that the voice might be coming from the ark, because in those days the word of the Lord was seldom heard, and no vision was granted. But it was indeed a call from Yahawah, as Eli finally realized. He told his pupil how to answer. If he calls again, say, "Speak, Lord, thy servant hears thee." Samuel received and reported the message. It concerned Eli's sons, whom the astronaut intended to punish. After that, from Dan to Beersheba, all Israel recognized that Samuel was confirmed as a prophet of the Lord, and during the reign of Solomon, the ark had just been taken to its permanent place in the temple. Then the priests came out of the holy place, since the cloud was filling the house of the Lord, and they could not continue to minister because of it, for the glory of the Lord filled his house. 1 Kings 8:10-11. The method of thought that consists in reducing the unknown to the known in order to tame it would conclude that the ark was only a radio receiver and transmitter. But it was much more than that. It was not only the voice of Yahawah that was received between the wings of the cherubim, it was often Yahawah himself. He was really there when contact had been established. He did not come discreetly, as we have seen him do on various occasions. He was accompanied by a cloud. When he used the ark to speak to the Jews, it was always with deliberate solemnity. Communications carried on in the tabernacle had a clearly official nature. Let us recall that the temple, which was to be the permanent home of the ark, was built by Solomon in Jerusalem at Yahawah's express command. Its location was therefore not chosen at random, which means that if the theory of corridors deserves to be taken seriously, there must be one of those corridors above Mount Zion. I ask the reader to bear this in mind so that he can better understand the concluding chapters of this book. What I have just said about the ark suggests an analogy with certain magical practices. There is magic in the Bible, of course. We will examine a famous example of it. Arranging objects and materials in a certain way in order to tap a person's mind, soul, is a routine endeavor for a magician or an ordinary sorcerer. But the construction of the ark seems to me much more closely related to technology. A modern physicist, Maurice Denis Papin, has seen in it disturbing similarities to an electric condenser. The occurrence of power discharges is tried to the R from tilting by supporting it with his hand. 1 Chronicles 13:9-10. But in my opinion, this view underestimates the ark. It is hard to imagine what strange whim might have made the Jews carry an electric condenser with them on all their journeys. In any case, we can dispose of the suspicion of magic that might hang over the ark simply because of appearances. Placing a metal rod on the roof of a house and a wooden box with a glass panel in the living room in order to receive the voice and image of a national leader would also have every appearance of magic to someone who had never heard of television. In a television receiver, there are a certain number of electronic components, and in the ark, there was nothing inside the ark but the 2 tablets of stone which Moses had deposited there at Horeb. 1 Kings 8:9. At Bethel, one of the bases discovered by Jacob, he set up a stone pillar. Between Beersheba and Haran, west of the Dead Sea, he spent the night at a certain place. What did he use as a pillow? A stone. And then he had a dream, which was not really a dream, as we have seen. Yahawah spoke to him and promised him descendants, countless as the dust upon the earth. Genesis 28:14. It would be rash to carry these similarities any further, but we cannot fail to notice the presence of a stone wherever Yahawah speaks. When Jacob got up, he took the stone on which he had laid his head, set it up as a sacred pillar, and poured oil on the top of it. Genesis 28:18. Yes, there was a time when Yahawah spoke to the Jews and visited them. I have indeed turned my eyes toward you. Exodus 3:16. There was a time when wonders were part of the chosen people's everyday life. It was not this or that individual who worked those wonders, but Yahawah in person. His presence was necessary. There was a time when meeting celestial visitors was not something that happened only in supernatural tales, or at least the Bible says so forcefully, and the Bible has come to us across the centuries that swallowed up all other works from its period, except Homer, but we now know that Homer told the truth. Yahawah's technology was not infallible, however. Now and then details escaped him and belied the adage that he sees everything. He had located the little point of light known as Earth in the vast stellar world, and he guided his spacecraft through the corridors of the upper atmosphere. But when he had reached the level of the clouds, he sometimes had difficulty in finding his people. He suffered from a kind of far-sightedness, even when he was moving among human beings on earth. This appears as early as the 3rd chapter of Genesis, where he loses his first Jew. He calls out to Adam, "Where are you?" A commentator has written, Yahawah pretends not to know where the man and his wife are hiding. I will let him take responsibility for his statement. It was dictated to him by the conviction that Yahawah is the God who sees everything. He based it not on his reading of the text, but on the preconceived idea. I read the text in the manner of Descartes, who cleared his mind of everything that had previously been inculcated in it. And to me, it means that Yahawah had lost Adam, that Adam had only to hide among the leaves to escape from his Creator's sight. The Bible gives disciplinary reasons to explain the chosen people's long wandering in the Sinai wilderness after leaving Egypt. 40 years of going and coming, when the distance from the Nile to Canaan was only 300 miles. It is hard not to add another reason, which the astronauts certainly appreciated. 600,000 pedestrians moving with their weapons, children, and baggage could be easily spotted from the air in a barren, uninhabited region that formed a relatively plain background against which they stood out clearly. During those 40 years, Yahawah intervened frequently, so he had to avoid the need to be constantly looking for his people. Thus was born and developed the religion of the wilderness. Yahawah had all the more reason to want efficient methods of locating his people, because he had other planets to supervise, as I have already said. There can be no better proof of this than his placing of a bow in the Earth's atmosphere. My bow I set in the cloud, sign of the covenant between myself and the earth. When I cloud the sky over the earth, the bow shall be seen in the cloud. Then will I remember the covenant which I have made between myself and you, and living things of every kind. Genesis 9:13-15. Nothing forces us to assume that the bow in question was the rainbow, which has well-known causes and must have been visible even before the formation of Adam. Yahawah marked the earth as a laboratory worker marks a test tube containing a culture whose development he wants to follow. The nature of that sign is unknown to us. We can only observe that it was adapted to a moist environment. Perhaps a cloud was necessary for its luminosity. Marking techniques, particularly those using radioactive elements, have made such progress in recent years that there is no reason for us to be surprised by the idea of making a sign on a planet. That sign reminded Yahawah of the stage reached by the inhabitants he had placed on Earth. If he had not placed inhabitants on other planets, the mark would have been useless. The fact that he needed a reminder shows that the worlds he had seeded were numerous. We may therefore assume that there are Jews not only on Earth, but also on many other inhabitable planets. If Gagarin's successors ever go beyond the solar system, they will encounter some of those Jews. At the end of the 40 years in the wilderness, the chosen people set off to conquer an already inhabited territory where they would be in contact with other peoples. How would Yahawah be able to recognize his own? How would he know who was a descendant of Jacob and who was not? How were the Israelites to signal their presence to a spacecraft high in the sky? Let us ask ourselves this question. What would we do to attract the attention of a spacecraft? What did resistance fighters in World War II do when an airplane was about to make a clandestine landing? They lit fires in a pattern previously agreed on. Columns of smoke in daylight or flames at night were the best means of marking their position. The smoke of sacrifices comes to mind. No, that's impossible. And yet, the codification of sacrifices can be regarded from an exclusively religious viewpoint, but if it is also the grammar of a visual language designed for communication with an aerial traveler, its purpose is even clearer. At any rate, here is a biblical story in which a sacrifice is made for the obvious purpose of transmitting a signal. Balaam told Balak, king of Moab, to build 7 altars and sacrifice a bull and a ram on each of them. When this had been done, he said to him, "Take your stand beside your sacrifice and let me go off by myself. It may happen that the Lord will meet me. Whatever he reveals to me, I will tell you." Numbers 23, 3-4. And Yahawah did meet Balaam. There is nothing in the passage about honoring the divinity. Yahawah ordered that animals be sacrificed when possible. Smoke from them is heavier and denser than smoke from burning plants. He received the sacrifice of Abel, the shepherd, but not that of Cain, the farmer. The Israelites were not allowed to burn any animal they pleased, in any way they pleased. The space traveler had to be able to tell the difference between the smoke that rose from the altars of his people and the meaningless fires of pagans. This interpretation does not exclude the religious aspect of sacrifice. When an Israelite burned a bull or a ram, it lessened his personal wealth. It was a tribute paid to the superior being, who appreciated it insofar as he was not the infinite and eternal God, for whom the smell of burning flesh does not seem a very appropriate gift. Sacrifice, a physical means of communicating with Yahawah, can be adapted to the mystical realm. It then becomes a means of communion with the divinity. The tool is promoted to the rank of a symbol. Blazing sacrificial fires in the territory where the Hebrews lived, stately columns of smoke on holy days. The whole ritual routine showed the traveler flying over Palestine that the chosen people were observing his commandments and staying within the geographical bounds he had assigned to them. If one tribe or another lapsed into idol worship, the sacrificial rites were altered, and Yahawah, having learned of the sin, could intervene, brandishing calamities. No, no one could say, Yahawah has abandoned the country. Yahawah does not see. The abundance and regularity of sacrifices kept him informed of the movements and behavior of his proteges. Such was Yahawah in the time when he created the Jews. We must now ask why he created them. Chapter 9. Why Yahawah needed the Jews. What can be desired by a man capable of traveling from one galaxy to another? A man who has universal knowledge, inexhaustible sources of energy, and the key to transmutation. A man who, as we will see, is able to alter the genetic code of the Earth's inhabitants, transform its climate, and set off processes that accelerate evolution. What more can he want? His vast powers and knowledge have lifted him above the human condition, and he has become to some extent the master of the world. He has approached the divine condition, but he is not God. Far from it, in fact. On his home planet, Yahawah conquered power in a durable way, or at least so we may suppose. If not, Earth has been visited by a succession of beings like Yahawah, who all have the same desires and therefore pursue the same tasks. The Bible contains no reference to Yahawah's home planet. That does not concern Earthlings. All that concerns them is whether or not the space traveler is available to take care of them, once he has taken them in hand. Yahawah is not God, and never really will be, but he can become a materialization of God, a visible substitute for him. The Almighty is imperceptible. Yahawah can be apprehended by the eyes and the ears. Only a subtle mysticism can place the soul in communion with the Almighty, whereas a God who can be seen and touched is within everyone's scope. To be God is to be worshipped as such, to receive the homage of the universe, the hymn of the celestial spheres that turn for no purpose. In short, it is to be recognized by the universe. But the universe is matter. The stars do not think. The vast reaches of space are starkly void of consciousness. There is consciousness only where human beings have appeared. Yahawah conceived the towering ambition of becoming God for those human beings. Man is the consciousness of the universe, its eyes, hands, ears, nose. He is intelligence scattered over the planets, a minute but vastly important sprinkling. In his smallness, he is greater than the universe, since he can apprehend it by his thought. It takes billions of years and an immeasurable quantity of energy to make a planet. It takes more billions of years before it takes on a serene aspect and the first lichens and amoebas appear. Then how much more time must pass before a deer bounds through the forest? Yet the deer is not the end product of evolution on the planet. There is no one to give it a name or draw its graceful movements on the walls of a cave. That cannot happen till man appears. Yahawah did not invent man. He himself was a man, an accomplished man at the highest stage of development, but only a man. Yahawah's idea was that his greater advancement in relation to the intelligent creatures could be used to give him a preeminent place in the universe forever, to establish his authority and make him become the Lord. In a sense, his plan was essentially one of colonization, except that he did not expect any strategic or economic advantage from his colonies. He expected only satisfaction of his need for domination, for being respected, honored, and possibly loved. The profit he wanted was not material, but spiritual. He was a colonizer in the manner of a missionary, and that missionary preached on his own account. The God he brought was himself. From the fact that he began by planting a garden and placing Adam in it to cultivate it, we must not infer that his goal was to develop the earth and reap benefits from it. We will see later how the Garden of Eden fits into the overall plan. In any case, it cannot be regarded as an agricultural enterprise. The whole Bible belies such an interpretation. Yahawah's constant concern is of a religious nature. The laws he promulgates, the advice he gives, and the organization he sets up are designed to govern morality, rights to be observed, and man's relations with God. In the texts that express them, we find hygienic, social, and juridical rules intended to guarantee the survival and cohesion of the chosen people, but almost nothing that bears any resemblance to a treatise on agriculture. And an agronomist would not demand that a tenth of all the animals raised be made to go up in smoke. He would turn them into steaks and chops, then freeze them and send them off to wherever they would be consumed. Yahawah wanted to be worshipped by the inhabitants of earth who had come forth after the animals on the sixth day, in accordance with the plan of the Almighty. But those inhabitants turned out to be rather disappointing. The big-jawed, narrow-skulled Pithecanthropus was not very well suited to indoctrination. He had discovered the use of tools, but it would take him an incalculable time to invent the wheel, if he ever did. On the assumption that evolution proceeds by successive mutations, the accident necessary to increase his cranial capacity and make him think of something a little higher than his daily venison might never happen. But on the assumption of divine intervention at each new stage in the progress of matter toward life and intelligence, why should Yahawah not play the part of God? He had the power to do it. He could speed things up, and his intervention would also have the advantage of making the result be closer to what he wanted. I will make a man according to my taste, he said to himself, a man in my image. My dominion over him will therefore have a metaphysical basis. I will make him intelligent so that he can get rid of those hairy hominids, sweep the planet clean, and take root on it. I will have a people of worshippers on earth, and I will be God. It was a delicate undertaking. Yahawah needed a people who would acknowledge him of their own accord. He wanted to conquer their hearts. An ordinary colonizer would have been content to make the natives work by terrorizing them with displays of his power. His goal would have been to obtain a certain output from them, and he would have achieved it. But Yahawah had no need of products from the planet's soil. His creation would not be successful unless he made his new human beings deeply loyal and devoted to him. What proof do we have of Yahawah's ambition? His behavior and his own words. He constantly revealed his intentions. I shall dwell in the midst of the Israelites. I shall become their God, and by my dwelling among them, they will know that I am the Lord their God, who brought them out of Egypt. I am the Lord their God. Exodus 29:45-46. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to become your God. Leviticus 25:38. In Leviticus, a collection of essential laws, the phrase, I am the Lord your God, recurs often. It is a slogan of insistent propaganda that motivates all obligations and justifies even the most unexpected demands. Offering sacrifices was an inadequate sign of allegiance. The ties that bound man to his God had to be reinforced by all the acts of life. Obviously useful moral rules were combined with rules that seemed perplexingly gratuitous. The lawgiver's reasons for condemning divorce and murder are understandable. It is harder to see why he allowed his people to eat fish with scales, but not lobster. Taboos were piled up until a Jew could not undertake any activity or eat any kind of food without first asking if Yahawah allowed it, and if so, how he should go about it. The legalistic aspect of the Jewish religion originated in Yahawah's wish to be constantly in his people's thoughts. Twice a day, the Jews recited the Shema, passages from the Pentateuch in which Yahawah's intentions are quite clear. One of those passages is Deuteronomy 6:4-9. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, one Lord, and you must love the Lord with all your heart and soul and strength. These commandments which I give you this day are to be kept in your heart. You shall repeat them to your sons, and speak of them indoors and out of doors, when you lie down and when you rise. Bind them as a sign on the hand, and wear them as a phylactery on the forehead. Write them up on the doorposts of your houses and on your gates. Here we get a glimpse of a religion of love that did not wait for Christianity to reveal it. Yahawah wanted to be loved. That was part of his plan, but he did not count on it too much. Love was demanded only in passing and did not occupy a place in the foreground. It was more realistic to demand observances enforced by punishments. Love, which cannot be enforced, would be the crowning of the edifice, not its foundation. When Yahawah organized large-scale expeditions on earth, he sometimes did it to force respect for moral laws. He concerned himself with David's conduct and the sexual practices of the people of Sodom, and sometimes to help his people against their enemies. It never had anything to do with matters of agricultural technique. The most exemplary punishments were directed against those of his people who had worshipped idols. There were several reasons for this. To worship idols made of elements taken from the soil was to turn back toward oneself, toward one's planet, instead of making hymns of praise rise up to the skies through which Yahawah's spacecraft moved. It was a withdrawal that denied the God the Israelites had given themselves. Even the wise Solomon fell into sin. In his old age, he did what was wrong in the eyes of the Lord and was not loyal to the Lord like his father David. He built a hill shrine for Chemosh, the loathsome god of Moab, on the height to the east of Jerusalem, and for Milcom, the loathsome god of the Ammonites. And worshipping idols meant adopting a forbidden polytheism. One of the enigmas I have not yet mentioned is that, possibly with a few minor exceptions, the Jews were the only ancient people who were monotheistic. The key to it lies in the intervention of a being alien to Earth. Man naturally deifies natural forces, which are multiple. He therefore imagines a pantheon of gods whose number depends on how many elements he has succeeded in isolating and how much he is inclined toward hair-splitting distinctions. The Romans, a legalistic people, had an amazing number of divinities. The Israelites, who were equally legalistic, had only one. They were often seduced by their neighbors' idols, however, and in this they were only following an inclination that is natural to all human beings. Their singular monotheism is almost enough in itself to prove what I am trying to demonstrate. Someone altered the natural course of things. An outside experimenter guided a people's development in the direction he wanted it to take, in opposition to ordinary anthropological laws. In fashioning a custom-made people, did Yahawah achieve what he set out to do? Partially, but in some ways he failed. He hoped that the Jews he had formed would replace the native population on the surface of the globe. Be fruitful and increase, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea, the birds of heaven, and every living thing that moves upon the earth. Genesis 1:28. But his specially created people proved inadequate to the task. The natives coexisted with them, and still do. Yahawah had to reduce his expectations and be satisfied with maintaining a people of worshippers on earth. Even the deluge did not wipe out primitive mankind, as is shown by the presence of the mysterious Anakim, whom we will discuss later. The elimination of non-Jews still remains to be done, and will be done if we are to believe biblical prophecies. In other respects, however, the creation of the Jews was a successful venture, since they have succeeded in remaining themselves down to our time, testifying to the power of their God. The Bible publishes its first victory bulletin in the 4th chapter of Genesis, with the 3rd generation of Adamites. Seth too had a son, whom he named Enosh. At that time, men began to invoke the Lord by name. That was what mattered. The goal had never been anything else. In Genesis 5:22, we read that Enoch walked with God. That is, he strictly observed the law. This fabulous personage is spoken of with dread. The book devoted to him was withdrawn from the canon of the Bible. It is now an accursed book and can be found only with difficulty. What is the reason for that? What happened to Enoch that was so frightful? In the context I am trying to establish, his experience has a logical explanation. Enoch, the man who walked with Yahawah, did not die. Genesis 5:24 says that he was seen no more because God had taken him away. When the 44th chapter of the apocryphal book of Ecclesiasticus draws up a list of the heroes of our nation's history through whom the Lord established his renown, Enoch's name is the first to appear. Enoch pleased the Lord and was carried off to heaven. This tradition reached St. Paul, who says in Hebrews 11:5, by faith Enoch was carried away to another life without passing through death. He was not to be found because God had taken him. For it is the testimony of Scripture that before he was taken, he had pleased God. What happened to Enoch? To where was he taken away? We may assume that Yahawah needed him elsewhere. He did not take away Adam, who showed certain weaknesses and disobeyed his Lord in the early days of creation, or Cain, who transgressed the law, or Seth, to whom no particular compliments were given. Enoch was a good specimen of the new human breed and could therefore be used for certain purposes. What purposes? They seem rather clear in the light of what we know. Satisfied with his new breeding stock for the moment, Yahawah had no need to start over again from the beginning in his next implantation. He took a specimen to serve as the first ancestor of a new chosen people on another planet. Perhaps we will someday know the name and location of the planet that is now the home of Enoch's descendants, cousins of the Jews on earth. On this view, we may assume that the peopling of that other planet took place under better conditions, since Yahawah, having profited from his experience on earth, was able to avoid the trial and error aspects of his first creation. Was it for a similar reason that he later took away the prophet Elijah in a chariot of fire? Yahawah, a tireless missionary on his own behalf, now concerns himself less with the Jews on earth than he did in the past, but he has an excuse for his neglect. The cosmos is gradually becoming filled with his seed, and an increasingly large number of heavenly spheres are singing his praises. Please stay tuned for part 4 coming soon. Peace, blessings, much love and enlightenment to you all. Paix, bénédiction, amour et illumination à vous tous. Shalom.